Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recycled Content, a podcast of the Association of Plastic Recyclers, an international nonprofit and the only North American organization focused exclusively on improving recycling for plastics. I'm Kara Pachiro, and I'll be handing over hosting duties to APR's Technical Director, Scott Trenner, for today's episode. So, Scott, I'll let you take it from here to tell us more about today's topic as well as our featured guest.
Thanks, Kara, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So, because recycled plastics are frequently used in food contact packaging, plastic reclaimers can seek a no objection letter, and commonly referred to as an NOL, which we'll talk about later, from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The NOL signifies that the FDA has reviewed the company's recycling process, including how they collect and sort material, how they process that material, and has no concerns about its ability to produce material suitable for food contact use for the various use categories. While it's not an official approval, it indicates that the agency finds the process effective in removing potential contaminants. And we'll dive much more into this with our guest today. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Sean Fisher joining us today. Sean joined the FDA in 2020 as a regulatory review scientist within the Division of Food Contact Substances. He's an FDA subject matter expert on the use of recycled plastics in food contact applications and leads the FDA's review program for recycling processes intended to produce recycled plastics for food contact. Prior to joining FDA, Sean was a research chemist at the U.S. Naval Research Lab and holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Washington. Thanks for joining us today, Sean.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
So let's start with a little bit of background. Can you kind of introduce our listeners to what the regulatory management branch within the human food programs at FDA is tasked to do?
Absolutely. And hopefully everyone can keep up because I'm going to be throwing a lot of names at everyone real quick here. I'm in the regulatory management branch within the Division of Food Contact Substances, which is in the Office of Pre-Market Additive Safety, in the Office of Food Chemical Safety, Dietary Supplements, and Innovation, in the Human Foods Program at FDA. And so we are the consumer and industry point of contact for FDA's regulation of food contact substances, providing guidance on and interpretation of food contact regulations, as well as answering general inquiries from stakeholders. So the scientists in the regulatory management branch are responsible for coordinating the reviews of industry submissions on food contact substances, such as food contact substance notifications, threshold of regulation exemption requests, and pre-notification consultations. And then we also are the ones communicating to those notifiers FDA's questions and responses to those submissions. And then additionally, we also work with the Office of Critical Foods within the Nutrition Center of Excellence in the Human Foods Program here to review the packaging component of infant formula notifications. And then, of course, perhaps most important to our current audience is we also administer FDA's voluntary review program for the use of recycled plastics in food packaging.
How do you fit all that in?
It keeps us busy for sure.
Yeah. As you know, at APR, we focus on recycling of plastics, right? And we've been fortunate enough to have you join a couple of our working groups and technical committees to really give you and us, more than anything else, right, a great interaction and real-time feedback, essentially. Our core members are the reclaimers who manufacture the post-consumer recycled plastics. Many of these companies have PCR that is suitable for food contact. Before we get into how the FDA is involved with recycled plastics for food contact, can you help settle a bet between Kara and I? So earlier, I referred to it as a non-objection letter. I see lots of references to the letter of non-objection. Which one of us is right? And I won't say who said what, so we can both win.
My understanding is that's a bit of FDA's fault. So the way I understand it, if you go back in our history, especially prior to the implementation of the threshold of regulation approach, FDA issued a lot of opinion letters on general food contact substances as to whether they would be something that either would qualify as a food additive in that it would be expected to migrate to food, or something that we had no objections to the use of and didn't think it needed to actually have a regulation in place, because this was also before the implementation of the food contact substance notification program, which expedited a lot of reviews. Those were generally referred to as no objection letters. And my understanding is once FDA got into the business of reviewing recycling processes and was issuing similar opinion letters on those, there was a desire to distinguish between these two kind of types of opinion letters. And that's where the letter of no objection, or LNO abbreviation, came from. However, we weren't consistent with either one of those. And so that's why you can find both references to this day. Actually, when I took over leading the program here, I recognized this kind of confusion about the two things and have tried to at least make us consistent going forward. And so you should now see anything coming from FDA will only refer to an NOL, because that is what actually we used on our website. So I thought that made the most sense to, try to stick with rather than changing the website. But if you use either one, we know what you're talking about.
Great. So I won't say who won, but maybe you owe me a drink at the next conference. So thanks. Can you help just give us an idea and understand how you're involved with the whole recycled content and the evaluation of the processes to eventually get to an NOL?
Sure. So generally, FDA is responsible for establishing the safe conditions of use for substances that come into contact with food. And so we have regulations that authorize polymers for use in food contact applications. And those regulations are generally applicable in that they do not specify a source for the polymer. And they also, in contrast to the FCM program, are not manufacturer specific. As such, these regulations actually authorize recycled materials as well as virgin materials, provided those materials comply with the limitations and specifications and any other requirements in those regulations. As a result of that, no FDA action is required for recycled plastics that comply with all of those requirements. However, as I'm sure many of the listeners are aware, recycled plastics present kind of unique challenges compared to virgin plastics when you're talking about food contact. FDA has two main safety concerns with the use of recycled plastics in food packaging. And one, that unauthorized resins or additives may be incorporated into the final food contact articles made from those recycled plastics. And the other is that incidental chemical contaminants that are coming from the prior use of the materials may remain in the recycled materials and then could migrate to food. So to address these concerns, FDA for the last 35 years has been encouraging recyclers to submit information to us on their recycling process for that informal opinion on the ability for their recycling process to produce material that is of suitable purity for its intended use. And so as we've discussed, these opinions are the NOLs that we've been talking about, and we maintain an inventory of those that we've issued on our website.
Right. So when a reclaimer comes to you and says, I'm interested in an NOL, what's the kind of form or boxes that they have to tick? What type of information do they need to share with you so you can begin the process?
Yeah. So as I said, it's kind of wrapped around those two main safety concerns that I mentioned: the presence of unauthorized resins or additives and incidental chemical contaminants. So the first concern, the presence of unauthorized substances in the package, in the material itself, is mainly addressed through source control measures. So, recyclers need to be selective about the articles that they're including in their feedstock to ensure that the materials that they're using, that they're recycling, are authorized for food contact applications. And then that source control aspect also helps with that second concern I mentioned, as if you're being more selective about what goes into your process, then you have a better idea and better control over the potential contaminants from the prior use of that material. And so restricting your feedstock to only food packaging is expected to have lower levels of those incident contaminants compared to if non-food packaging is included in the feedstock. And then to further address the concerns about chemical contamination, FDA recommends that recyclers conduct a surrogate contaminant test, also referred to as a challenge test, to establish that their recycling process is capable of removing those incidental chemical contaminants at worst case contamination levels to what FDA considers to be of negligible risk for a contaminant migrating to food. And we've established that level based on the scientific analysis that supported our threshold of regulation exemption approach at 0.5 parts per billion in a dietary concentration. And so just to emphasize, this review process is not intended to obtain pre-market authorization of new substances. Those need to go through primarily our FCN program. And so, like I said, if anything is included in there, anything included in the feedstock should be authorized for its use. And if it's not, then it would need to obtain pre-market authorization before it could be used in contact with food.
Maybe just a follow up. So the 0.5 parts per billion in dietary intake, that's not this plastic recycled pellet has 0.5 parts per billion of something. It's based on the modeling of that something leaving the plastic pellet and getting into us.
Yeah, so that 0.5 parts per billion is the concentration in the food. And the way FDA does consumers' exposures, that takes into account the fraction of someone's diet that comes into contact with a particular material and assumptions about migration from the plastic to the material. So if you're talking about the actual concentration in the pellet of the contaminant, it would be a higher value because obviously you'd have to account for all these things of the migration to food and then how much of food is contacting that particular material to come up with a consumer exposure.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So let's say I submit all the information to you, FDA. I'm sure there's a back and forth between you and the reclaimer saying, can you fill in some gaps or there's some additional information we could need. FDA sends a letter of non-objection. Is that it? Is there like a renewal process every certain years? Are there follow-up procedures in order to keep the NOL current?
So as is the case also with our authorizations for food additives and food contact substances, our letters and recycling processes don't expire. On the flip side to that, if new safety information on a substance becomes available, we'll reevaluate the safety of the uses for that substance and take appropriate action based on that new assessment. And if there's a modification to the way a substance is manufactured, then in particular, if it's that authorization is through the FCN program, then the manufacturer is required to notify FDA of the details of that change and how that impacts dietary exposures. Within the context of the no objection letter, that opinion that we've rendered on that recycling process is based on the information that was included in the submission. If there are changes made, such as a new feedstock is being included, there are changes to the processing conditions or the intended use, then that opinion may no longer be applicable because it was based on different information. We designed our review process, as I mentioned earlier, looking at kind of that worst case contamination scenario for the given feedstock. And so the idea is if you show up front that it can cover this contamination, then there isn't necessarily the need for checks on every batch that comes out of that process. Now, recyclers may still want to do that for other reasons, but that wouldn't be something that we would be looking for. And so really, we just encourage, if there's something that new that comes up, we would encourage a recycler to come back and talk to us about it and see if the opinion that we offered before still stands.
Okay. So if they were to, you were to limit a specific feedstock stream and they want to add, I don't know, a new type of package, right? As we continuously move glass and metal and aluminum from those to plastic, right? So if they were to add a new format, they would come back to you and say, here's what you said before. Here's the new material or stream that we want to include, and there would be a new non-objection letter, assuming it all checks out.
Yeah, exactly. And we've done that previously. It's not necessarily obvious on our website the way we post things now, but we have had recyclers come back to us either wanting to expand the feedstock, the types of materials that are going in, or, expanding the intended use. Like they generated some new data and showed that the material is actually suitable for broader use than what they originally considered. And so we've issued new opinions on those expansions.
Great. And that's actually a perfect segue. We hear often that food contact non-objection letter material isn't available. It's hard to find. My understanding is that you have all the NOLs published on your website. So if I'm a converter or a brand looking for food contact material, what type of information is included on your website? What can I learn about the different technologies and suppliers?
Sure. And so, yeah, like you said, and we mentioned earlier, we do have an inventory on our website that lists all of these NOLs that we've issued. To date, we are over 400 NOLs issued, and we include the date that that letter went out, the company to which we issued it, the plastic that is being recycled, and then the intended use that we reviewed, and then also indicate whether that recycling process is a physical or mechanical recycling process or a chemical recycling process. And then if we're looking at, through the first half of this year, we've issued over 245 letters on PET, and that was to over 300 or 130 different companies. We have 115 NOLs on polyolefins, which includes, HDP, LDP, LLDPE, and polypropylene. And that's going to over 60 different companies. And we have 31 letters on polystyrene to 20 different, over 20 different companies. As the review process, as we mentioned, is voluntary, recyclers don't need to inform us if they, for instance, have abandoned one of the processes that they previously submitted to us. So it's possible that some of those letters that are on our website are for processes that are no longer being used. However, we are aware of numerous instances of other recyclers essentially sub-licensing a process that's subject to an NOL. And that includes letters that we issued more than 20 years ago.
So have you seen a pickup in letters and submissions over the last few years?
Absolutely. So we've seen a dramatic rise in the interest in recycled plastics. And I don't remember off the top of my head right now, but it was something like, as I mentioned, we're over 400 letters issued now. It took, I believe, on the order of about 17 years or so to issue those first 200 letters. And then the second 200 letters were issued in less than 10 years. And so we've seen a dramatic rise in the number of submissions we're receiving. And every year we're receiving more and more submissions.
Interesting. So maybe a little bit on the use and some not so great press on the use of, I guess, what were termed to be recycled plastics. I'm not sure it was ever proven, but there have been a few reports recently where researchers have measured the presence of things like brominated flame retardants in kitchen utensils and other products that come into contact with food. And I think the one I'm thinking about most recently, the original academic publication, I think has been corrected twice due to some math errors and interpretation errors where they significantly overestimated the daily dose. But, a kitchen spatula that's manufactured elsewhere and imported in, is the FDA involved in that type of oversight, or does it have oversight in those types of imported materials, or who evaluates those types of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So FDA would have purview over those kitchen utensils. And so we evaluate the substances that are used to make them. And really from the recycling perspective here, cases like you mentioned here, highlight the importance of the source control, like we were talking about earlier. And that includes, recycling processes that are going to be used to make material that goes into kitchen utensils. There are no authorizations for brominated flame retardants for use in food contact applications. So we would expect if they are present in food contact articles that it would be the result of, contamination of the feedstock stream. And most likely, flame retardants are often found in plastics used in electronic applications, and they serve an important function in those devices. But that makes those devices inappropriate for inclusion in the feedstock of a recycling process that's intended to make food contact articles. So recyclers, need to be diligent about the sourcing of their feedstock so they know what the potential contaminants and risks are there and whether their material is actually going to be suitable at the end. And anytime FDA is alerted to potential contaminants such as brominated flame retardants in food contact articles, we investigate the issue and remove those products from the market when appropriate. And if I remember correctly, we do have an import alert related to brominated flame retardants in food contact articles.
Interesting. I didn't know that last part. So that's good. It's something that I think we can kind of look up and find some more information on. Well, we're talking about imports, right? There's a lot of recycled plastics imported and exported between ourselves and Canada and Europe. And I think Canada Health has LONO. I think I have that acronym right, and that seems pretty well aligned. EFSA is kind of in a reinvention, maybe, or reworking of their food contact requirements. Do you work closely with those other organizations? And, what are some of the similarities and differences between how you approach recycled plastics in food contact applications?
Sure. Yeah, FDA does work with our international other regulatory groups to share relevant information and inform our food safety policy decisions. And some of the differences in approaches to recycled plastics really go back to differences in how food contact materials are treated more generally. So in the US, FDA's approach to safety is based on that safety standard of a reasonable certainty of no harm. And we evaluate that dietary exposure that we kind of touched on earlier, derived from the potential for migration of substances to food. And then that's compared with safety values derived from tox studies. And so, that's kind of the general how we evaluate the safety of something. And so then that informs how we then look at recycled plastics. In contrast, if you take something like how the European Union is set up, their approach is kind of looking at evaluation of specific and overall migration limits for a substance, and they don't quite approach the dietary exposure question the same way. Additionally, kind of broadly speaking, FDA has harmonized regulations and standards for essentially all types of food contact articles, plastics, paper, adhesives, etc. Whereas in Europe, they have a harmonized plastics regulation, but for other types of food contact articles, they don't really have a harmonized regulation broadly. And so, like I said, that really kind of informs how we then approach recycled plastics. And so obviously there's some differences in the guidances and the specifics, obviously, on the administrative side, but we think we're offering, broadly similar levels of protections to consumers at the end of the day.
Yeah, I seem to remember, I think it was a conference that was in Europe a couple years ago where you joined virtually, and there was a counterpart of yours from EFSA, and you went through your presentation and how you calculate, and then EFSA representative said, well, we do something very different, but then at the end of the day, we get to about the same answer, right?
Yeah, it's, two paths to basically the same thing. So they can, and I can understand that, they may look very different to someone like a recycler trying to prepare submissions to each agency. But it does, once you've kind of peeled it away and understood the underlying concepts in each, they do kind of get to the same point.
So is there a path forward to kind of figure out how, using that same point, we can get towards, a more global, I was going to say approval, but that's not the right word, right? So a global kind of non-objection for recycled plastics. So reclaimers can do one set of tests in the US and be good with, Canada and Mexico and Europe and other regions that allow for recycled materials in food contact applications?
That's a difficult question to answer, considering we're only one piece of that global picture here. I will say we are currently working on updating our guidance for industry on the use of recycled plastics in food packaging. And as part of this, we are looking closely at the guidances and regulations that other regulatory authorities are putting out, trying to find out where those similarities are, where those differences are, and what makes the most sense for us in terms of making recommendations to recyclers to ensure safety and ensure compliance. And, part of the hard part is, like I said, it's, you have different regulatory schemes that are kind of in the background as you're talking about all this, and you have to kind of make sure each place is aligning with their regulatory schemes. But To your point, the U.S. is actually leading an effort within Codex Alimentarius for their Committee on Contaminants in Food to develop guidelines for recycling processes for use in making recycled plastics for food packaging, which we hope will help kind of produce a little more, harmony across the globe to have this international body establish kind of some at least some high level guidelines. And we're working on proposing that for like I said, the Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food to take up that work. We are working with, some other governments and trying to put that together. So hopefully we will be able to get something out there that will make the guidance seem, illustrate how there is kind of more harmony than there might appear to be.
That'd be great. And, as you work towards that, are there things from reclaimers from our membership, right? Is there information that we could supply to you to help build that case?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, we're working on updating our own guidance. And as I also touched on before, FDA has been reviewing recycling processes for 35 years. We've learned a lot about plastic recycling over that time, but there are still areas where we're kind of lacking in information. And for, kind of much of that 35-year history, we could make rather conservative assumptions to kind of make up and fill those gaps that we didn't have without it really hindering industry too much, because there wasn't a big demand for recycled plastics for most of the time. As I'm sure you're well aware, that's no longer true. That's not the world we're living in anymore. There is huge demand out there. It's growing. And as we touched on, FDA is seeing a huge increase in the number of submissions that we're receiving. If you look at the last couple of years, we're close to about a factor of 5 more submissions than we used to receive. And so as we move forward to continue ensuring the safety of food packaging made with recycled plastics, enabling those industry innovations to meet that demand, we want to work with industry. We want to work with you and your members to fill these knowledge gaps that we have. And specifically, things like what kind of contamination levels are recyclers seeing at the beginning, those incident contaminants that we talked about. And then what resins and additives are in use in food packaging, as well as non-food packaging, that can help us provide better guidance around what's appropriate for inclusion in the feedstock, what's not appropriate for inclusion in the feedstock. And then subsequently at the other side of that, based on what went in, what's that material suitable for the use? Because just because something is authorized for food contact doesn't mean it's authorized for all contact with all food. You could have temperature restrictions, food type restrictions. We don't want to be unnecessarily restrictive on things just because we lack information. So if industry has some information they can provide to us that let us, refine our recommendations and make things as open as possible while still making sure that the safety of everything involved has been reviewed and we have a good handle on that, then that's where we want to go.
Great. And you mentioned updating your own guidance a couple of times and then the need for information. And I believe that you'll be joining us in October in Salt Lake City to kind of give us an overview of the updated guidance, maybe some more specific examples of information that you'll need. Can you kind of give us a little snapshot of a preview of what you're thinking you're going to share with us in October?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm hopeful that I will be able to make it out there. And if I am, then yeah, absolutely. I'll be sharing some more details, providing more specific information about this is the information we're looking for, and this is why we're looking for that information, so that everyone has this more complete picture about why we're asking the questions we're asking and what we want to know, to try to hopefully reassure recyclers that you could talk to us. We're not that scary.
I don't know. You don't seem so scary so far today. So far, so good.
I'm hoping we can, be able to have this. I'll be able to go to this meeting and make those personal connections, and we can have some more dialogues and really have a better working relationship with the recyclers, because we're trying to fulfill our mission of ensuring the safety of things that come into contact with food, while also trying to help recyclers do what they're trying to do.
Great. Yeah, we're looking forward to it, and we hope that whatever aligns on your side, Shay, to get you out to Salt Lake City works out, and we're more than happy to have that conversation with our membership.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much to Sean for joining us today. Definitely not scary at all. And we do look forward to seeing you in Salt Lake and hope you can make it. Lots of helpful information today. And so glad we finally cleared up the debate on LNO versus NOL. Thanks so much, Sean. And thanks to Scott for hosting today on a topic that he is obviously well versed in too. So you were a great host. And thanks to everyone for listening. For more information about the FDA, visit fda.gov. And for more information about APR, recycling plastics, and much more, visit the APR website at plasticsrecycling.org. Check us out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X at APR Recycles. And you can find recycled content wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review.
This podcast was recorded in the studios of
Policy Bandana